Now, hardly 2 years since the revolution, the promise of a democratic future for Sudan hangs in the balance. Tensions are growing in the country because of the rising cost of living. And the transitional government, which is made up of civilians and military officers, has been very fragile. Now, the situation further deteriorated after military leaders blamed the civilians in the government for a coup attempt this week. More on that in a moment. But first, we catch up with the woman who became the symbol of Sudan's uprising.
At the height of Sudan's mass protests in 2019, as the people stood up to the former dictator Omar al-Bashir, suddenly the movement got its symbol. Images of a young woman rallying the crowd started to go viral. Soon, the world came to know Ala Salah as the woman in white.
It was not planned, but spontaneous. I had not decided in advance to stand there singing and shouting.
And as many were captivated by the image, they also found meaning in it.
When I see this picture, it is not myself I see. I see the Sudanese woman, her courage, her voice, demands and enthusiasm.
Those traits in this young woman brought her to the world stage. A few months after the revolution, Salah got to address a meeting of the UN Security Council.
I said, I represent Sudan. Today the country radiates hope for freedom, peace and justice. I'm so glad I started and ended with the slogan of the revolution.
That revolution brought down the regime, and in came a transitional administration. Sudan's troubles are far from over, and the political tension remains, most recently with a foiled military coup. Protests continue to flare up over the tough living conditions, the very issues that ignited the protests nearly 3 years ago. Last year, prices were lower. This year, prices have doubled.
Everything is getting down after the revolution, but unfortunately everything is getting double, 3 times higher.
The road ahead is still a long one for the people of Sudan. But like Ala Salah, they know they can play some part in steering the country forward.
And we've invited Khulud Khayat to talk more on the current situation in Sudan and the course that the country is on. Khulud is a political analyst at Insight Strategy Partners, and she specializes on Sudan. Khulud, it's good to see you. We've just heard from one woman there, but what is the sentiment in the country right now, especially among those who took part in the protests? How do people feel about where the country is and where it's going?
Well, before the coup, I would have said that there was a lot of public sort of apathy and despondency and disappointment with the pace the transition is taking, particularly in the formation of key transitional institutions like the parliament, and the standards and costs of living, etc. I think what we have seen in just the past few days is that revolutionary spirit in the streets is very much there. And given the right circumstances, such as an attempted coup, you will find that the streets re-galvanizing and pressing for, the civilian-led democratization process that everyone wanted and fought for in 2018.
OK, so let's talk now about the latest coup attempt, right? That the government said that forces loyal to former President Omar al-Bashir were behind it. But what do you make of the timing of this and the fact that the military leaders in the Transitional Council are basically blaming their civilian counterparts for it?
I think in the first place, a civilian-military alliance to govern during the transitional period was always going to be difficult. What we have seen is that, forces within the military, and when I say the military, this is actually a very sort of fractured group of armed actors. They all have even competing interests within themselves. And we have the same thing within the civilian government, also a lot of fragmentation. So it's a very uncomfortable alliance that is not really well geared at the moment to make decisions and pass things and get things through. So what we've seen from the head of the armed forces, who is also the head of the Sovereignty Council, is that there are lots of divisions within his ranks, and perhaps he wasn't able to get a hold of these different factions, one of whom stage the attempted coup, the failed coup. But what we've seen in the past 24 hours was the head of the Sovereignty Council, General Burhan, appear on TV, and he was much more contrite. So he had sort of walked back his initial response to the failed coup, which was very much to blame the failures of the civilians. Interestingly enough, this has happened many times before. The civilians have always been blamed for the failures of the transition period, even though the military is often the one who is sort of standing in the way of real reform. And so what we have today, as of this morning, is a much more contrite, much more conciliatory tone from the head of the Sovereignty Council. And to what extent we can now expect these divisions between the military and the civilians and within either camp to be healed enough to have a proper reform process go forward remains to be seen. But it's encouraging to see that sort of vitriolic language that we saw from the military, both Burhan and Hemeti, has been walked back.
Sudanese people want a democratic future. That is, they want to vote in a civilian government when this when the transitional period is over. Could this latest coup attempt get in the way of that?
If anything, the immediate impact seems to have been that the street has now become much more engaged in the sort of transformational agenda throughout this transition period. There was, as I say, that period of apathy before. What the demands of the streets that we're hearing is very much aligned with the civilian camp in the government, which is that no one is interested in early elections. We want to see through this transitional period. We want to see through the handover of the control of the Sovereign Council, which acts as the presidency, to the civilians within a transition period, so that the key institutions like the parliament, the constitutional court, can be set up before we head towards elections. There's not really a point of heading towards elections sooner rather than later, because key developments in sort of cultivating constituencies and cultivating political platforms have not yet been undertaken, and it would be far too early to rush into elections now.
All right. That is Khulud Khair talking to us there. Thank you, Khulud. We appreciate your insight.
Thank you.